Hi there. Thanks for viewing my presentation. I am working on an applied research project which is about augmented reality and community-based learning in the context of post-secondary undergraduate education. I teach in a 2-year program in a small college in northwestern British Columbia, and I have been working as a faculty there for 5 years. My institution forwards a strategic plan around experiential place-based learning, and so I have had the good fortune to mentor under leaders in experiential education. I became interested in augmented reality through the MALAT program. I had colleagues present on augmented reality in one of our classes, and I became quite interested to use it in my own classes. I was encouraged by Elizabeth, the coordinator of the MALAT program, to look at augmented reality and the intersections of my teaching practice prior to actually adopting it. Augmented reality is a technology that has recently become accessible in post secondary due to the cell phone technologies being ubiquitous. It has been well studied as a tool for simulations in post secondary education, but how it can be used in different approaches to teaching and learning is something of interest to researchers currently. My research questions are around: in what ways can augmented reality be used as a tool for community based learning in post secondary undergraduate education? And in what ways can AR provide opportunities for students and faculty to adopt experiential education approaches? The theoretical framework I rely on is experiential education. This stems from constructivism and social constructivism. I quickly came to realize that even though I understood what experiential education is, or I had an idea of what it is, there are many different ways to define experiential education. And so I had to really get into what the definition was in very practical terms. And so my definition relies on Jay Roberts' themes of experiential education. And he has 4 themes. They are active learning, integrative learning, problem based learning, and community based learning. Experiential education is understood differently by different practitioners. So, having that definition really laid out for myself helped to ensure that my research was scoped well. Commonly understood as part of experiential education is something called Kolb's learning cycle, which is the process that experiential education engages with, which is basically the scientific method. Kolb discusses a concrete experience, a reflection on that experience, then an abstract conceptualization of the concepts from that experience, and then a reiteration. So it is a cycle that is guided, if done well, by faculty. The methodology that I worked with was a metasynthesis of qualitative case studies. As part of this, I looked at the transformation from traditional ways of teaching towards working with experiential education at an institutional level. I got an opportunity to interview a leader in that in Canada. I did another interview, which was around adopting technologies with faculty, with a leader or, a manager of learning technologies at a major university in British Columbia. And then I interviewed a woman who works with augmented reality, co constructing augmented reality for community based learning. Now, that was outside of post secondary. However, these 3 interviews helped inform me about what are the needs um, of post secondary education. How do we shift from traditional to more experiential approaches? So, my methodology for the literature was looking originally at what are the results of using AR with experiential education in post secondary education encounters. Again, I had to look at what my definition of experiential education was very carefully, and I had to reiterate what it is I was seeking. What I found through my research is there is not a gap when it comes to active learning. Nobody needs to study whether or not augmented reality works with active learning. It does. It does promote knowledge building in active learning. And so I pulled that out of my research. There was no gap there for me to fill. I also took out integrative learning as part of my work because integrative learning had such a broad definition. There's no way that I could incorporate it into my project within the time frame I had. So the two that were left was community-based learning and then problem-based learning. And what I did was I looked very closely at what studies were working with problem-based learning, but were in fact community-based learning. So if they had an element where they were working in a community, about a community, or for a community, they were kept. And that allowed me to scope my project into augmented reality and community-based learning, which I then narrowed down to 16 good articles about that. So, what are the barriers or concerns with adopting community based learning approaches was something that I looked at in my needs assessment. So, first of all, we know we need time for anything that has to do with experiential education. Um, we don't think of experiential education in terms of hours of contact. It needs to come into play in terms of how much time do people really need to learn. When we look at what is required for CBL, we're looking at experimenting. So, how do we allow students to experiment, discover, and construct knowledge within whatever our time limits are for a class? Time limitations are a barrier. For CBL, I also looked at the risk of reputation. So, when conducting community-based learning, the risk for faculty is that and institution is that students don't conduct themselves well in a community setting. Perhaps learning can sometimes make you seem a little less professional. And so, how do we protect our students while also protecting faculty and institution reputation while we allow students to learn in community? Um, so, how are they protected while making their first approaches at understanding and experimenting? It is really something that requires consideration. Without that consideration, faculty are reluctant to adopt CBL approaches. CBL also requires us to understand the meaning of place to different people. So, often cultural differences, the difference in depth of relationship to a community, and thus the understanding of the place and the community can be a point of pain within that learning experience. So, whether you're a visitor to a community, you are a steward of the land, whether you have a colonized viewpoint or a colonizer lens of place, all impact how learners and facilitators interpret a place and interpret a place for community. Student control of this actually increases the ability to decolonize those lens overall for a positive effect. In terms of how we use AR with community-based learning, I have broken down my drafts into when using AR in community, about community, and for community into different considerations. So, first of all, in community, we might consider to be the most shallow use of CBL and AR. You can see this in game-based learning. So if you play Pokemon Go, although that's not an educative experience, that is you're moving around in a community, sort of gaming learning. So some of the considerations that faculty need are safety and faculty as potential content creators. When we look at community-based learning where it is about community, we use AR in ways that are about interpreting places. We're not creating. We could be using an app. We could be using something that a faculty member created, but the students themselves are not creating it. Some of the considerations need to be about safety, again, about time, how faculty can build interactivity around that, and again, faculty as content creators. And when we look at community-based learning for community, students are actually creating AR experiences for a community. So how places are interpreted, faculty as content creators, how students interact with the community, and time considerations all come into play. So this is sort of my rough draft. I certainly am not finished with my recommendations, but this is where I'm at today. Thanks so much for your time. And here are my references. Good luck in your MALAT journey.